The Masons Guild of York is said to date from AD 79, in the time of Agricola, and they built a Roman temple at the time, and the Carpenters Guild, which dated from AD 626, which built a church of wood on the model of the Tabernacle of Moses. In the year 765, a renowned teacher of the liberal arts and sciences in York called Edwin was commissioned by the Archbishop of York to oversee the building of a new church in that city, along with another priest, Eanbald. He was, by this commission, recognized as the chief master of building works, such as those under Hirma Beef were expected to undertake. For anyone who is interested, you should know that there is a poem written by this scholar-architect that describes his task. In the years that followed, Edwin was finally persuaded to move to Aachen in northern France to serve the Holy Roman Emperor, Carolus Magnus, as not only the head of the new courtly school there, but also to advise the emperor on the building of his new chapel, hence the other name of the place, Aix-la-Chapelle. What you should know is that in one of the letters to the emperor, Edwin describes his new place of worship as being another Temple of Solomon. Moreover, in an allegorical passage referring to the chief members of the court of Charlemagne, Edwin is referred to by the name of either Flaccus or Man Ingratius. The city of York in the north of England is celebrated for its traditional connection with Freemasonry in the kingdom. No topic in the history of Freemasonry has so much engaged the attention of modern Masonic scholars, or given occasion to more discussion, than the alleged facts of the existence of Freemasonry in the 10th century at the city of York as a prominent point, of the calling of the Congregation of the Craft there in the year 926, of the organization of the General Assembly and the adoption of a constitution. During the whole of the 18th and the greater part of the 19th century, the fraternity in general have accepted all of these statements as genuine portions of authentic history. More recently, the discovery of many old manuscripts directed the labors of such scholars as Yoon, Woodford, Lyon, and others to the critical examination of the early history of Freemasonry, and that of York has particularly engaged their attention. One must read both, the tradition and the history. In pursuance of this plan, we propose to commence with the legends of York Freemasonry, as found in the old manuscript constitutions, and then proceed to a review of what has been the result of recent investigations. The legend which connects the origin of the English Freemasonry at York in 926 is sometimes called the York Legend, sometimes the Athelstan Legend, because the General Assembly, said to have been held there, occurred during the reign of that king, and sometimes the Edwin Legend, because the prince is supposed to have been at the head of the craft, and to have convoked them together to form a constitution. The earliest extent of the old manuscript constitutions is the ancient poem commonly known as the Hallowell or Regius manuscript, and the date of which is conjectured, on good grounds, to be about the year 1390. In that work we find the following version of the legend. For the benefit of those who are not familiar with this archaic style, I will translate the passage into modern English. This craft came into England, as I tell you, in the time of the good King Athelstan's reign. He made then both hall, and also bower and lofty temples of great honor, to take his recreation in both day and night, and to worship his God with all his might. This good Lord loved the craft full well, and proposed to strengthen it in every part on account of various defects that he discovered in the craft. He sent about into all the land, after all the masons in the craft, to come straight to him, to amend all these defects by good counsel, if it might so happen. He then permitted an assembly to be made of divers lords, in their rank, dukes, earls, and barons, also knights, squires, and many more. And the great burgesses of that city, they were all there in their degree. These were there, each one, in every way, to make laws for the estate of the masons. There they sought by their wisdom how they might govern it. There they fought out 15 articles, and there they made 15 points. The next document in which we find this legend recited is that known as the Cook manuscript, whose date is placed at 1490. The details are here much more full than those contained in the Hallowell manuscript. The passage referring to the legend is as follows. And after that was a worthy king in England, that was called Athelstan, and his youngest son loved well the science of geometry, and he wished well that handcraft had the practice of the science of geometry so well as masons. Wherefore he drew him to Eansol, and learned the practice of that science to his speculative. For of speculative he was a master, and he loved well masonry and masons, and he became a mason himself, and he gave them charges and names as it is now used in England and in other countries, and he ordered that they schedule and have reasonable pay, and purchased a free patent of the king, that they schedule and make an assembly when they saw reasonable time, to come together to their council, of the which charges, manners, and assemble, as is right and taught in the book of our charges, wherefore I leave it at this time. This much is contained in the manuscript from lines 611 to 642. Subsequently, in lines 688 through 719, which appear to have been taken from what is above called the Book of Charges, the legend is repeated in these words. In this manner was the foresaid art begun in the land of Egypt by the foresaid master Euclid, and so it went from land to land and from kingdom to kingdom. After that, many years, in the time of King Athelstan, which was sometime king of England, by his council, and other great lords of the land, by common assent for great default, he found among the Masons, they ordained a certain rule amongst them, one time of the year or in 3 years, as need were to the king, and great lords of the land, and all the community, from province to province, and from country to country, congregations should be made by masters, of all manner Masons, and fellows in the foresaid art. And so at such great congregations, that they be made masters, should be examined of the articles after written, and be thoroughly examined, whether they be able and skillful to profit of the lords to serve them, and to the honor of the foresaid art. 70 years later, in 1560, the Lansdowne manuscript was written, and in it we find the legend still further developed, and Prince Edwin, for the first time, was introduced by name. That manuscript reads thus. Soon after the decease of St. Albans, there came diverse wars into England out of diverse nations, so that the good rule of Masons was disturbed and put down until the time of King Athelstan. In his time he was a worthy king of England, that brought this land into good rest, and he built many great works and buildings, therefore he loved well the Masons. For he had a son called Edwin, the which loved Masons much more than his father did, and he was so practised in geometry, that he delighted much more to come and talk with the Masons, and to learn of them the craft. And after, for the love he had to the Masons and to the craft, he was made a Mason at Windsor, and he got of the king, his father's, a charter and commission once every year to have assembly, within the realm where they would within England, and to correct within themselves faults, its trespasses that were done, ads touching the craft, and to beheld them in assembly. And there he made Masons, and gave them charges, and taught them the manners and commands the same to be kept ever afterwards, and tutel them the charter and commission to keep their assembly, and ordain that it should be renewed from king to king. And when the assembly were gathered together, he made a cry, that 311 old Masons or young, that had any writings or understanding of the charges and manners that were made before their kings, wheresoever they were made Masons, that they should show them forth. There were found some in French, some in Greek, some in Hebrew, and some in English, and some in other languages. And when they were read and overseen well, the intent of them was understood to be alone. And then he caused a book to be made thereof, how this worthy craft of Masonic was first founded, and he himself commanded, and also then caused, that it should be read from time to time when it should happen any Mason or Masons to be made, to give him or them their charges. And from that until this day, manners of Masons, which had been kept in this manner and found, as well as men, might govern it. And furthermore, at diverse assemblies have been put and ordained diverse charges by the best advice of masters and fellows. All the subsequent manuscripts contain the legend substantially, as it is in the Lansdowne, and most of them appear to be mere copies of it, or, most probably, of some original one, of which both they and it are copies. In 1723, Anderson published the first edition of the Book of Constitutions, in which the history of the fraternity of Freemasons is, he says, collected from their general records and their faithful traditions of many ages. He gives the legend taken, as he says, from a certain record of Freemasons written in the reign of King Edward IV, which manuscript, Brother Preston asserts, is said to have been in the possession of the famous Elias Ashmole. As the old manuscripts were generally inaccessible to the fraternity, and, indeed, until comparatively recently but few of them have been discovered, it is to the publication of the legend by Anderson, and subsequently by Brother Preston, that we are to attribute its general adoption by the craft for more than half a century. The form of the legend is given by Anderson in his first edition very slightly from that in his second. In the former, he places the date of the occurrence at 930 AD, in his second at 926 AD. In the fourth, he styles the congregation at York a general lodge. In his second, a grand lodge. Now, As the modern and universally accepted form of the legend agrees in both respects with the latter statement, and not with the former, it must be concluded that the second edition, and the subsequent ones by Entick and Northrop, who only repeat Anderson, furnish the form of the legend as now popular. In the second edition of the Constitutions, page 63, published in 1738, Anderson gives the legend in the following words. In all the old constitutions it is written to this purpose, that though the ancient records of the Brotherhood in England were most of them destroyed or lost in the war with the Danes, who burnt the monasteries where the records were kept, yet King Athelstan, the grandson of King Alfred, the first anointed king of England, who translated the Holy Bible into the Saxon language when he had brought the land into rest and peace, built many great works, and encouraged many Masons from France and elsewhere, whom he appointed overseers thereof. They brought with them the charges and regulations of the foreign lodges, and prevailed with the king to increase the wages. That Prince Edwin, the king's brother, being taught geometry and masonry for the love he had of said craft, and to the honorable principles whereon it is grounded, purchased a free charter of King Athelstan his brother, for the Freemasons having among themselves a connection or a power and freedom to regulate themselves to amend what might happen amiss, and to hold an yearly communication in a general assembly. That accordingly Prince Edwin summoned all the free and accepted Masons in the realm to meet him in the congregation at York, who came and formed the Grand Lodge under him as their Grand Master in A.D. 926. That they brought with them many old writings and records of the craft, some in Greek, some in Latin, some in French, and other languages, and from the contents thereof they framed the constitutions of the English lodges, and made a law for themselves, to preserve and observe the same in all time coming, etc., etc., etc. Preston accepted the legend and gave it in his second edition, page 198, in the following words. Edward died in 924 A.D. and was succeeded by Athelstan, his son, who appointed his brother Edwin patron of the Masons. This prince procured a charter from Athelstan, empowering them to meet annually in communication at York. In this city, the first Grand Lodge of England was formed in 926 A.D., at which Edwin presided as Grand Master. Here, many dead writings were produced in Greek, Latin, and other languages, from which it is said the constitutions of the English Lodge have been extracted. Such is the York legend, as it has been accepted by the craft, contained in all the old manuscripts from at least the end of the 14th century to the present day, officially sanctioned by Anderson, the historiographer of the Grand Lodge in 1723, and repeated by Brother Preston, by Oliver, and by almost all succeeding Masonic writers. Was there an assembly of Freemasons held in or about the year 926 at York under the patronage or by permission of King Athelstan? There is nothing in the personal character or the political conduct of Athelstan that forbids such possibility or even probability. He was liberal in his ideal, like his grandfather, the great Alfred. He was a promoter of civilization. He patronized learning, built many churches and monasteries, encouraged the translation of the scriptures, and gave charters to many operative companies. In his reign, the faith gilkin, free guilds, or sodalities, were incorporated by law. There is, therefore, nothing improbable in supposing that he extended his protection to the operative Masons. The uninterrupted existence for several centuries of a tradition that such an assembly was held requires that those who deny it should furnish some more satisfactory reason for their opinion than has yet been produced. Incredulity, says Voltaire, is the foundation of history. But it must be confessed that, while an excess of credulity often mistakes fable for reality, an obstinacy of incredulity as frequently leads to the rejection of truth as fiction. The Reverend Moodford, in an essay on connection of forts with the history of Freemasonry in England, inserted in Youn's unpublished records of the craft, has critically discussed this subject, and comes to this conclusion. I see no reason, therefore, to reject so old a tradition, that under Athelstan the operative Masons obtained his patronage, and met in General Assembly. To that verdict Dr. Mackey subscribed. Was Edwin the brother of Athelstan, the person who convoked that assembly? This question has really been discussed in the article Edwin, where the suggestion is made that Edwin alluded to in the legend was not the son or brother of Athelstan, but Edwin, king of Northumbria. Francis Drake, in his speech before the Grand Lodge of York in 1726, was, Dr. Mackey believed, the first who publicly advanced this opinion, but he does so in a way that shows that the view must have been generally accepted by the auditors, and not advanced by him as something new. He says, "You know, we can boast that the first Grand Lodge ever held in England was held in this city, where Edwin, the first Christian king of Northumbria, about the 600th year after Christ, and who laid the foundation of our cathedral, sat as Grand Master." Edwin, who was born in 586 A.D., ascended the throne in 617 A.D., and died in 633 A.D. He was preeminent among the Anglo-Saxon kings who were his contemporaries for military genius and statesmanship. So inflexible was his administration of justice that it was said that in his reign a woman or child might carry everywhere a purse of gold without danger of robbery. High commendation in those days was almost unbridled rapine. The chief event of the reign of Edwin was the introduction of Christianity into the kingdom of Northumbria. Previous to his reign, the northern metropolis of the church had been placed at York, and the king patronized Paulinus, the bishop, giving him a house and other possessions in that city. The only objection to this theory is its date, which is 300 years before the reign of Athelstan and the supposed meeting at York in 926. Are the constitutions which were adopted at the General Assembly now extant? It's not to be doubted that if the General Assembly was held, it must have adopted constitutions or regulations for the government of the craft. Such would mainly be the objects of the meeting. But there is no sufficient evidence that the regulations now called the York Constitutions, or the Gothic Constitutions, are those that were adopted in 926. It is more probable that the original document and all the genuine copies of it are lost, and that it formed the type from which all the more modern manuscript constitutions have been formed. There is the strongest internal evidence that all the manuscripts from the Halliwell to the modern have a common original, from which they were copied with more or less accuracy, or on which they were framed with more or less modification. And this original Dr. Mackey supposed to be the constitutions which must have been adopted at the General Assembly of York. The theory, then, which Dr. Mackey in preparing this article concluded may safely be advanced on the subject, and which in his judgment must be maintained until there are better reasons than we now have to reject it, is that about the year 926 a General Assembly of Freemasons was held at York under the patronage of Edwin, brother of Athelstan, at which assembly a code of laws was adopted, which became the basis which all subsequent Masonic constitutions were framed. York. York, the county seat of Yorkshire, is one of the oldest cities in England, and one of the most famous cities in the world, next after London itself. Speculative Freemasonry's mother city, it is also the great Masonic city. The Britons had a town on its site before the Roman occupation. The Romans themselves established a barracks there, and later organized the town and its environs as a colonial or municipality. It was for years the home of King Athelstan. When its Paulinus was made archbishop in 627 A.D., it became the seat of the archbishopric, which ever since has ranked second in importance only after Canterbury. Edwin of York was selected by Charlemagne as the teacher of himself and his sons about 800 A.D., because the cloister school of which Edwin was head was so renowned, and because York itself was the Oxford of the day, and scarcely less known on the continent than England itself. The War of the Roses, England a most terrible war, was fought between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. It also had for some 2 centuries a primacy in the fine arts, and more Gothic architecture was crowded into its limits than in any other center. Its minster is one of the sublimest structures ever built anywhere, or for any purpose. Its fame as a Masonic city rests on many foundations. Number 1. A bishop of York attended the Council of Arles in 314 A.D., and the council records indicate that he was given precedence over the Bishop of London. Such a bishop must have had a bishop's church or cathedral, and it is likely, therefore, that York began to be a center of architecture and of its sisters' arts and attendant skilled crafts as early as the 4th century. Number 2. Had Athelstan's name never been mentioned in the Old Charges, he would have a large place in Masonic history, because he was the king of operative Freemasonry as well as the king of England. York was Athelstan's home. He built or rebuilt many structures there, and it is probable that the city already had its guild hall, and very probably what later would be named a city company of masons. Also, He built and rebuilt much in London, and was so interested in the work personally that rules and regulations for craftsmen bulked large in his laws and edicts. Also, he was a city builder, a role to which even kings are seldom admitted, for while Exeter had been a Welsh city before him, he moved the Welsh out, and in their place built a new city according to a plan of his own. When the Old Charges attribute to Athelstan a great interest in Freemasonry and a great love for Freemasons, they do not exaggerate. Indeed, they all fall short of the whole truth, because apparently the author of the Old Charges knew nothing of Athelstan's work outside of York. Number 3. In one version of the Old Charges, it is stated that at an assembly of Freemasons in York in 926 A.D., Athelstan gave the craft a royal charter, a document which carried in itself a higher authority than one issued by either the Church or any lord of a lesser degree, or any other city. The other versions of the Old Charges say Athelstan had been titular head of the fraternity of Freemasons, but had made over his title and prerogatives to his son, Prince Edwin. Historians question this tradition because, first, it is unsupported by contemporary records. Second, because no trace of a son of Athelstan named Prince Edwin has ever been found. And third, no trace of the charter itself, either in a copy or in quotation, has been discovered, although it is reasonable to think that Freemasons would have preserved many copies of a document so important to themselves. Gould questioned the tradition because he did not believe that general assemblies of the craft had ever been held. But his argument is dubious, because if the craft had not held assemblies, a number of kings would not have issued edicts to prohibit them. It is possible to reinterpret the whole problem of the assembly at York and of the royal charter said to have been granted here, and to do so without stretching the evidence. Athelstan himself, and not through an agent, was a direct employer of Freemasons at York, at London, at Exeter, and doubtless elsewhere. That which was a written contract at the time may have come to be thought of as a charter afterwards. Also, as stated above, Athelstan himself drew up rules and regulations for the Freemasons, and incorporated them in his written laws. In so doing, and also while acting as an employer, both his own laws and contracts would specifically prove, at least by implication, the Freemasons' own rules and regulations. If these reasonings be sound, the tradition of a charter granted by Athelstan becomes true in substance, if not true in form, and for the Freemasons had some point. Number 4. The first permanent lodges were established about 1350 A.D. According to both civil and ecclesiastical law at the time, such a body had to have a charter. It also had to make returns, that is, to report their rules and regulations and their membership to the civil authorities. It is reasonable to believe that the Old Charges were written partly for each of these purposes. If it be objected that the Old Charges are not a charter, but only the claim that Athelstan had already granted them a royal charter long before, the fact only proves that the Freemasons themselves in 1350 A.D. believed literally in the York tradition, but what idling this connection far more important, Gould and Mackey both overlooked that importance. The Chit authorities themselves believed it, and permitted the permanent lodges to continue to work under the Old Charges. Had those civil authorities disbelieved it, they would have rejected the Old Charges and compelled the lodges to seek civil charters. Belief in the York tradition, and for whatever it may be worth, rests not only on a modern theory about a supposed event 1,000 years ago, but on a belief held by both Freemasons and civil authorities in the 14th century. The latter were 4 centuries removed from Athelstan, but that was not then as wide a gap in time as it would be now, when change is at least 50 times as rapid, because in the Middle Ages written official documents were preserved with great care, and this is especially true of York, as readers of Sir Francis Drake have discovered. Number 5. The Fabric Rolls of York Minster, published by the Surtees Society, Durham, 1859. We learn that in 1509 there were 2 craft lodges at York in existence, and the historian Kugler says in his Handbuch der Kunstgeschicke that in the 12th and 13th centuries near York a school of architecture was in existence. Number 6. There was an old Grand Lodge in York, no doubt of a predominantly speculative membership, before the Grand Lodge was erected in London in 1723. How old it was, there is no way of discovering, but it is on record as early as 1705 A.D. According to its own minutes, it was sometimes called a Grand Lodge, and sometimes a General Lodge. By this latter term, it was probably meant that it had set up daughter lodges. In 1725 A.D., it was termed The Old Grand Lodge of York, Grand Lodge of all England. Number 7. When a group of London lodges set up in 1751 AD, that Grand Lodge, which everywhere was to become famous as the Ancient Grand Lodge, its appeal to English Masons who had already had 2 Grand Lodges, was based on its claim to recover and preserve the ancient customs. These customs it attributed to the York Grand Lodge. Both R. F. Gould and William J. Yoon stigmatized this use of York as an Americanism. How could it have been when it originated in York itself, in the London Grand Lodge of 1751 AD, and came to the American colonies via Canada? Moreover, it is only popular and uncritical usage that York Rite is employed in America. The doctrine that Freemasonry originated in York has been officially adopted. The great work on York is the one entitled Eboracum, a thick tome of amazing erudition written by the above-mentioned brother and Dr. Sir Francis Drake. It is a huge volume in fine print, almost suffocatingly packed with facts. Any beginning Masonic researcher could look far and not find a better specialty. It is a mine for Masonic essayists. In it, countless old customs and symbols preserved in Freemasonry appear in the form of records or minutes made at the time of their use. York manuscripts. Originally, there were 6 manuscripts of the old constitutions bearing this title, because they were deposited in the archives of the Grand Lodge of all England, whose seat was at the city of York. But the manuscript number 3 became missing, although it is mentioned in the inventory made at York in 1779. Numbers 2, 4, and 5 came into possession of the York Lodge. Brother Yoon discovered numbers 2 and 6 in the archives of the Grand Lodge of England at London. The dates of these manuscripts, which do not correspond with the number of their titles, are as follows. Number 1 has a date of 1600, number 2 1704, number 3 1630, number 4 1693, number 5 is undated, but is supposed to be about 1670, and number 6 is also undated, but is considered to be about 1680. Of these manuscripts, all but number 3 have been published by the late brother William J. Yoon in his Ancient York Masonic Rolls, 1894. Brother Yoon deems number 4 of some importance because it contains the following sentence. The one of the elders taking the book, and that she or she that is to be made Mason shall lay their hands thereon, and the charge shall be given. This, he thought, affords some presumption that women were admitted as members of the old Masonic guilds, although he admits we possess no other evidence confirmatory of this theory. The truth is that the sentence was a translation of the same clause written in other old constitutions in Latin. It is evident that the charges thus to be sworn to, and which immediately follow, were of such a nature as made most of them physically impossible for women to perform, nor are females alluded to in any other of the manuscripts. All Freemasons there are fellows, and are so to be addressed. There are 2 other York manuscripts of the operative Masons, which have been published in the Fabric Rolls of York Minster, an invaluable work edited by the Reverend James Raine, and issued under the patronage and at the expense of the Surtees Society. Yorkshire is notably rich in the old charges, as besides those which formerly belonged to the York Grand Lodge, and are in possession of a modern lodge there, there are others in private hands, and in the West Yorkshire Masonic Library. It is stated in a manifesto of the Lodge of Antiquity, 1778, that there was 1 manuscript in the hands of Mr. Wilson of Broomhead, near Sheffield, written in the reign of Henry VIII, which is now missing, and there appears to have been one dated 1560. The Lodge of Hope, Bradford, has a copy of circa 1680. It forms no part of our plan to give an account of these old manuscripts, but students of them are greatly indebted to the late brother Thomas W. Chew, past Grand Master of West Riding, who had 8 of these in possession of his provincial library, printed and distributed at his sole cost. Amongst them are the Tomes W. Chew manuscript, circa 1680, and the Wasdale manuscript, circa 1693, and the Clapham manuscript, circa 1700. The rolls in possession of the lodge at York have also been printed by subscription. One of these, dated 1704, is headed with the same anagram as Masonry as that in 1600, but addressed by Robert Preston to Daniel Moult. It also appears in a Newcastle roll, addressed by Richard Stead to his friend Joseph Claughton. There are other documents at York, but none older than the reign of Anne, 1702 to 1714. It seems that George Benson was president in 1705, and that he was followed by other gentlemen at each annual election. We learn also from old copy of the charges which was passed into the possession of the Grand Lodge of Canada that a private lodge was held at Scarborough, Yorkshire, on 10th July 1705, with Thompson, Esquire, as president, when 6 members were received whose names will be found in the facsimiles executed for the West Yorkshire Masons. Last century, the Grand Lodge of All England at York had minutes from the year 1704, but they are not now to be found. They have, however, at the York Lodge some later parchment rolls, which to some extent take place of minutes. The probability is that such information as we have prior to 1726 belongs to the operative guild.